And welcome to this short video on IGCSE Marine Science Section 5.6 Sandy and Muddy Beaches. As always, these videos are made for my classes, but everyone is welcome to use them. Any mistakes here and mine alone, and all my work here is non-profit. So let's get rolling. Let's get on the beach. This syllabus and this chapter lines quite well up with the one on rocky beaches, and comparing a rocky and a sandy beach is a good exercise to do. And here we're going to compare the sandy and the muddy beach. But we're going to looking at zonation. We're going to looking at the features of the sandy and the muddy shore. We're going to look at the environmental factors, both biotic and abiotic, and we're going to look at two organisms to see how they adapt to living on a sandy shore. So, like on a rocky beach, we have zonation on a sandy beach. But while on a rocky beach, it's easy to see the zonation by where we have the blue mussels, where we have the seaweed, where we have the lichen. On the sandy beach, it's a little harder to see. But we still have our subtidal zone, our intertidal zone, and our subtidal zone. So on a sandy beach like this, the zonation is pretty much depending on how much water cover will there be. In our lower part of the tidal zone, we will have water on the sand for most of the time, so it will be mostly a marine environment. As we go higher up, the sand will be free of water for a longer and longer time, which means it will become more and more terrestrial, which means there'll be less and less water in the sand. Now, the upper zone pretty much extends from the high water mark, neap tide mark, to where the high water spring tide mark is. So it's somewhere between 1% cover from the top to around 20% cover at the bottom. Still at the top, it will be highly affected by like water spray, and it will be affected by salt water. So any plants you see growing there will be adapted to living in a saltwater environment. And then the lower zone goes pretty much from the low water spring tide mark to the low water neap tide mark. So it's covered from somewhere between 80% to 99%. And in between that, we have the middle zone, which is somewhere between 20 to 80% covered by water. There are many different types of sedimentary shores, including gravel, sand, silt, and muddy shores. It pretty much comes down to particle size. Now, here we're going to compare the sandy and the muddy beach, which is what they look at here in the syllabus. And it all comes down to how much disturbance there is and how the sediment size is. But this means a lot for the organisms who want to live there. Sedimentation, erosion, goes in and affect the shape of any coast, and it is affected by coastline shape, speed of current, power of the waves, and how much organic material there is in the sediment, as organic material tend to bind the sediment particles together. Larger particles of sand, they need more energy to move compared to smaller, lighter particles, and therefore the upper area of beaches often have larger particles of sand compared to the muddy areas further down the shore. Fine particles of sand and silt will erode more rapidly than larger coarse sand particles. Muddy shores with a high organic material content, however, have a low erosion rate because, as I said, the organic matter tends to glue the particles together. So if we compare the sandy and the muddy beach, the sandy will tend to have more turbulence than the muddy beach. The sandy will have larger particles than the muddy. Now the sandy, due to large particles, will have more oxygen content, while in the muddy beach there will tend to be a lower oxygen content, which becomes quite important when we start looking at stuff like the mangrove forest. There's a lower water content in the sandy beach at low tide. It tends to drain faster, while the muddy sediment contains more water and keep waterlogged for longer, thereby being muddy. Hence, the sandy beach will dry faster, while the muddy beach will dry slower. In the sandy beach, we see fewer bacteria, while in the muddy beach, we see a lot of bacteria, living there and living on organic matter, and also sometimes causing hypoxic or anoxic areas within the mud, or methane or sulfur production, which you can smell when you're walking on a muddy beach. Sandy beaches can be quite steep, while muddy beaches are usually flat. And then the sandy beaches are less stable because the particles are not bound together by organic matter, while the muddy beaches tend to be more stable. Now we go back to looking only at the sandy shore. When we look at how organisms they are distributed on the sandy shores, there are some abiotic and biotic factors that matters a whole lot, especially when you compare them to the rocky beach. The most important is that sand is an unstable substrate. On a rocky beach, there are, of course, rocks that your uh, blue mussels can attach themselves to, where the seaweed can attach themselves to, where the barnacles can attach themselves to. On a sandy beach, you can attach yourself to anything. There are few producer organisms because of that, as they can't really stick on to anything. Now, the lack of producers means that food webs are more simple, um, and organisms who live here usually have to either burrow or be able to move. Air temperature can change a lot over a sandy beach here, because when you're covered by water, it can become cold, and then on a sunny day, when the water retracts, it can become quite warm. Also, exposure to air. Um, when you're up high on a sandy beach, it can get quite dry at low tide, so organisms living here must be able to adapt to living without that much water. Biotic factors, predation. There are few areas to shelter, few areas to hide, so it's also more difficult to avoid predation. Shorebirds, they will be very effective predators for any smaller organisms lying around on the beach at low tide. That also means that, again, prey will tend to adapt to this either by burrowing, being able to hide or move. Food availability, well, there are fewer producers for herbivores to eat, so many of the food chains begin with stuff that eat detritus, such as lugworms, filtering mollusks, and so on. And then they become the start of the food chain for larger predators, mainly seabirds. Now we have a look at some of the organisms who adapt to living on a beach like this. Lugworms is a quite important one, and if you go on a walk on a Danish beach at low tide, you will see a lot of these small piles of sand, which is where the lugworm has its burrow. The lugworm is adapted to living here, so it can hide under the sand, and it will then ingest sand from one side and then eat whatever organic matter there is inside it, and then poop out the sand on these small burrows on the other side. They are also adapted to living in a low oxygen environment, both by filtrating water down there, but also by having hemoglobin that can help bind the oxygen so they can survive even at low tide when there's less oxygen in the water. The other organism we look at here are clams, and clams are in the mollusks family. They have two shells, and they're also able to burrow. And when they burrow, they have this large tube, the siphon, which makes it able for them to get water and oxygen down into the burrow when they're beneath the sand. Being beneath the sand again is, even though you have a hard shell for defense, is a very good way to avoid predation. Also, some of them are able to move both of their shells so they can swim short distances when you have a high tide, also to move to a new location.